im se svima, i malima i velikima, i bogatima i siromašnima, i slobodnjacima i robovima, dade žig na njihovu desnu ruku ili na čela njihova, te da nitko ne može ništa kupiti ili prodati, osim onoga ko ima žig ili ime zvijeri ili broj imena njezina.
Pozdrav, dragi narode, dobrodošli još u jednu epizodu Slobodni. Današnja tema su cjepiva, prvenstveno pedijatrijska cjepiva. I današnji moj gost je netko ko postavlja se pitanje šta može reći o cjepivima, jer mu to nije uža struka. Međutim, moram reći zašto volim razgovarati sa odvjetnicima. Zato što se oni moraju pripremiti kad dolaze na ročište. Moraju pročitati sve dokumente, pa i ono što piše malim slovima. Odvjetnik si ne može priuštiti da priča što misli. On mora sve dokazati. I zato je današnja tema važna, jer moj današnji gost je odvjetnik koji se dugi niz godina bavi zastupanjem oštećenih od cjepiva u Sjedinjenim Državama i ono što vam on danas može reći je ono što može i dokazati. Moj današnji gost dolazi iz Sjedinjenih Država, njegovo ime je gospodin Aaron Siri. Hello, Mr. Siri, welcome to our show in Croatia.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, you are here again in this show. That's why we can go directly on the topic. And my first and the most important question, why should people believe someone like a lawyer about vaccines?
Well, I don't have any medical titles. I can't rely on being a medical doctor, an MD, or a PhD, or an MPH when I make claims about vaccines in court. And I make a lot of claims about vaccines in court. We have over 50 people at my firm that just do vaccine-related work. I've deposed some of the world's leading vaccinologists. I've got endless lawsuits against federal and state health authorities. And when I go into federal court or state court and I make a claim about vaccines, whether I say it doesn't stop transmission or I say it causes this harm, I have to prove it with evidence, liable, solid evidence that prevails over the other side's evidence. I don't get to just say things. So on the topic of vaccines, especially on the topic of vaccines, I think that following the evidence, meaning listening to a lawyer who's had to actually engage with that, might be a better path.
And you wrote one book, great book, Vaccine, Religion of Vaccine. Why you call this book Religion of Vaccine?
Well, over the 10 years that I've been doing vaccine work, I have found that there is what the public health authorities tell you, and then there's what the evidence shows. They're not the same. And I've come to realize that so much of what people think about vaccines are really just beliefs. But unlike a typical religion where people know they're in a religion, they know they're taking a leap of faith, here they think that their views are based on evidence and science, and they're not. They're just beliefs. So I call it the Vaccines, Amen, the religion of vaccines. And I try to go through and show how so much of what people think they know about vaccines are just beliefs. They're contrary to the evidence.
Let's go through this religion, because in the book you put everything exactly like a religion. They have a highest priest, they have disciples, beliefs. Let's go through all of this.
Sure.
Well, we can say, who are these disciples? We can say Jesus had 12 disciples, and who are they here in the vaccine religion?
Well, most folks think of doctors as knowing, being knowledgeable about vaccines, or public health authorities, like the CDC. But the reality is that they almost all know very little, almost nothing about vaccines. They all rely on a small little group of folks that are called vaccinologists. People think they're a pediatrician who administers or gives the prescription to inject their children vaccine, know about vaccines. They don't know almost anything about vaccines. I've never deposed a pediatrician that knows virtually anything about the products. Neither do infectious disease doctors or immunologists. But this very small group of vaccinologists, they're the ones who conduct the clinical trials for the vaccines. They're the ones who then publish the studies on the vaccines. They basically perform and put together the trial data and the studies and the underlying data that the rest of the medical profession relies upon, that the federal health and state health authorities here in the U.S. rely upon to then create their guidance. And then that filters out to the public. So it all starts with this small group of vaccinologists who, I will tell you, any of them that don't engage in a manner that best suits pharmaceutical companies, they just stop supporting them. So they stop using them for their clinical trial. They stop supporting them to do studies. And so there's a form of selection bias, whereby the only vaccinologists that rise are the ones that are that do the least amount of safety, and they're the quickest to get efficacy, and will do the things that will increase pharmaceutical company profitability.
One of belief that vaccines saved millions of lives. Is this true?
In the United States, the idea that vaccines save millions of lives a year is just completely contrary to the data. That's off by probably 99.9 something percent or more. In the book, in chapter 7, I go through each vaccine in the US, the year it was licensed or widely used, and how many people died of that disease in the year before. What you'll find is for virtually all of them, it's dozens to hundreds often. That's far from millions. Now, every death is a tragedy, but it's nowhere near. I mean, cumulatively, it is almost an insignificant number of annual deaths in the United States. And critically, almost all of those diseases, the mortality was declining rapidly before there was even a vaccine. After the introduction of the vaccine, often that death decline continues at the same rate. I'm not saying the vaccine can't be attributed to potentially some of the reduction, but even then, even when there is a reduction after, at least part of it is probably nothing to do with the vaccine. But yet, the way the public health authorities talk about it, they will not only attribute all the decline after the vaccine to the vaccine, right? They'll even attribute the reduction of mortality before there was a vaccine to the vaccine. I'll use just more measles very quickly. Measles, the death rate in the US declined by over 98% from 1900 to 1963 when the first vaccine was introduced. Over 98%. That had nothing to do with the vaccine because there was no vaccine. And we were down to about 400 deaths a year. That's 1 in 450,000 Americans were dying of measles in the years before there was a vaccine, at a time when everybody got measles. That's far from what they lead you to believe. Now, that mortality would likely have continued. But yet you listen to the CDC and public health authorities, and they make it sound like the only reason that measles mortality declined was because of the vaccine. The funny part is public health authorities could take some credit for the decline before the vaccine, better sanitation, better living conditions, a better acute medical care, but they never do. They just point to the vaccine.
There is one interesting story about polio vaccine, and you explain inside after they introduce this vaccine, they change the protocols how to establish that somebody is sick from this disease. Can you explain us a little?
Sure. The very first polio vaccine was introduced in 1955 in the United States, the Jonas Salk vaccine. And up until 1955, to diagnose a case of polio, you needed to have some symptoms 24 hours apart. That's it. That's all you needed. A little bit of weakness in your legs, 24 hours apart, and they would diagnose you with polio. However, after they introduced the vaccine, they changed the diagnostic criteria. And what they did is they made it you need to have some symptoms 60 days apart, and you needed to have a laboratory confirmation that it was the polio virus. And so obviously by making the requirements a lot more stringent, that was going to reduce the number of cases of polio in and of itself. Now, two interesting things. Number one, when they started actually looking for laboratory confirmation, what they found is a lot of in a significant proportion of the cases, they didn't find the polio virus. They found Coxsackie virus. They found other viruses. So they realized a lot of the cases that they had attributed to the polio virus had nothing to do with the polio virus. It had to do with some other virus. That's number one. Number two, in 1960, around 1960, the scientist of the day, when it wasn't so controversial like today. I mean, today you say polio vaccine, it's like you just said the name of God, right? But back then, they could have that discussion. And they did a reanalysis where they applied the same criteria that they used from 1955 to 1960 for 1950 to 1955, right? So that to see, okay, what would the number of cases look like before and after? And what they found was there wasn't a significant differential when they applied those criteria, the same criteria, pre-55 and after 55. I know that folks are led to believe that polio was, when you actually run those numbers, the number of people actually affected with polio was relatively small, meaning even before using the old diagnostic criteria in 1954, there was around about 1,000 deaths they attributed to polio, and a few multiple of that of paralysis. Upon doing the reanalysis, it got even smaller. So in any event, it's an inconvenient historical fact.
There is an additional belief that vaccines reduce damage from disease. Is it true?
Well, some vaccines can prevent transmission, like the measles vaccine, for example, right? The measles vaccine can prevent transmission of measles. And so since it can prevent transmission, it can prevent you from getting measles, and measles can harm some children. Now, in developing countries, any virus can harm a child of any kind. Okay, measles, it doesn't matter. In developed countries, the amount of harm has gone down, over time significantly. And so what you need to really do is weigh what is the number needed to vaccinate, how many kids you need to inject, right, to prevent one serious outcome versus how much harm are you causing by the product. And that analysis needs to be done carefully. For example, for the hepatitis B vaccine, for a non-Hep positive mother, it's estimated based on the actual historical data of cases in the US, you would need to inject about 100,000 children, the Hep B vaccine, at least 100,000 kids, to prevent one case of chronic Hep B in a child for non-Hep B positive mothers. 100,000. So if you have about 3 million births a year in the United States, so that's about 38 cases. Is the vaccine causing less or more than that in serious harm? I could tell you, I've never seen a newborn baby die of hepatitis B. But there are cases of babies dying of the hepatitis B vaccine the first day of life, including one recently adjudicated to have died from a hepatitis B. Going back to measles is another example. Yes, the vaccine can prevent measles, so it can prevent harm. But studies have actually looked, first of all, measles vaccine can cause death for documented cases. Measles vaccine can cause encephalopathy, encephalitis, which means brain damage, brain swelling. Not my claim. The CDC's own documentation, affirms that that's the case. Now they'll argue about the rate, but it happens. And then separately, you have to look at this big picture, because people that have had measles have far less death, statistically less death from cardiovascular disease and from cancers. Again, I'm not making that up. It's all in the published literature. I lay it out in my book. So a 100,000 person study in Japan, for example, looked at those that got measles and mumps versus those that didn't. And those that had measles and mumps had a 20% decline in mortality and death from heart disease, from cardiovascular disease. That kills about 900,000 Americans a year, 900,000. So if eliminating measles increased mortality from cardiovascular disease by even 1%, forget 20%, even taking account of life years, because obviously life years of children versus adults are different, you're still completely upside down on your public health benefit. Then factor in the studies that show children and adults that have had measles have reduced rates of Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, ovarian cancer, which kill 20, 30,000 people a year, many of them children. You're really potentially upside down on your public health benefit. So the important point is that we need to look at these products rationally, not emotionally, not believing in them, not only focusing on, the measles vaccine can prevent one death of measles, that's it. No, that's not where you stop. You have to look at this on a big picture level. And when you do that, which I try to lay out in my book, you get a very different view, and you can start making better decisions about these products and what you're doing with them. I'll say it this way. I don't think God messed up, or if one wants to call it nature, that bad, that a child on the very first day of life, and at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, needs 25 injections of powerful pharmaceutical products.
Does this mean that there is a correlation or causation between measles as a disease and also decreasing in cardiovascular diseases?
Well, according to the Japanese study, and there's no study that contradicts it. So studies that are prospective, that are forward tracking, not using existing data, not historical data, are considered more reliable. This was a prospective 100,000 person study in Japan. So very highly reliable, that tracked 100,000 people for 22 years. They looked at a whole host of variables. This is Japanese government, major institutions there. It's a very serious endeavor that they undertook. And based on that data, I mean, it wasn't even like the confidence intervals were wide. They were very narrow. Okay, so for males, it was about 20% reduction in mortality. And the confidence interval was very tight for those who know what I'm talking about, which means that it's considered highly statistically significant outcome. Now, with a prospective study of that nature, that is often how one does establish causation or not causation. More data, the better. But with that kind of robust finding, unless somebody shows you data to the contrary, the heavy weighted evidence is that, yes, having measles and mumps does actually create that reduction. So it's a very inconvenient finding, which is why you're not going to hear public health authorities talk about it.
You mentioned hepatitis B vaccine. Now CDC doesn't recommend anymore to take this vaccine on a date of birth.
Well, as of yesterday, they took it off the schedule entirely as routine in the United States. Yeah. Yes. I mean, that, by the way, is in line with many other countries. I mean, Denmark, for example, vaccinates about 0.01 or 1% of children. They only give the Hep B vaccine to children of Hep positive mothers and certain very high-risk groups. So virtually no children in Denmark get the Hep B vaccine. Forget day one of life. They don't get it at all, period. And so you have virtually no kids get it in Denmark, a high rate in America. You know what the outcomes of chronic Hep B amongst children between the Denmark and the US? Not statistically significant. They're effectively the same. But you know what the difference is between vaccine injury from Hep B vaccine in the US versus Denmark? A lot in America, you got virtually zero in Denmark.
Yes, you mentioned that just yesterday CDC changed vaccine schedule. Can you tell us what changed? Which vaccine are still there? And what do you think? These 11 diseases that are still covering these vaccines, is there an explanation why they stay in this schedule?
Well, so starting with the ones that remained, President Trump asked that there be an evaluation comparing American schedule to peer nations, to other countries. And that evaluation, it found that there's these 11 diseases that you just talked about. Those vaccines are typically recommended in most other peer nations. And so they just weren't addressed. They were left alone. If you read the underlying report, it just said they're not considered. So they're not left because they were some thorough evaluation. To the contrary, they were just not addressed. Instead, what they did yesterday, for my reading of the documents, is they just addressed the vaccines that are not routinely given in peer nations. And so for those, they looked at it and they said, you know what? It makes sense. Those shouldn't be routine. So they pulled 5 vaccines off of the routine schedule in the US: Hep B, rotavirus, flu, meningococcal, and hepatitis A. So those 5 are no longer routinely recommended on the US schedule. So that removes a number of doses. Still leaves a lot, but it removes a good number.
Yeah, I think the number of doses were around 80, 85, and now it will be around 30.
Yeah, so in the first year of life, it's gone down now from routine, from 25 to about 18, so a reduction. And then it's about half the number over the full course of childhood now in the US.
There is one more belief that vaccine stopping a spread. Is this just belief, or we can prove this?
So for most vaccines, that's not the case. Most vaccines do not prevent transmission. They might reduce symptoms, but they don't stop transmission. Again, there's what people are led to believe, and then there's what the actual, even CDC and FDA and WHO admit in their internal documents, right? So most vaccines, even required for school here in the US, I don't know what it's like where you are, do not stop transmission. Pertussis vaccine does not stop transmission, as an example. In fact, if you're vaccinated with the pertussis vaccine, you're potentially more likely to transmit the pertussis bacteria because you are less likely to have symptoms, but you're equally as likely to have it being carried in your nasopharynx and kissing kids and your grandkids and so forth.
In the book, you said that the highest priest of this religion is Mr. Stanley Plotkin, and you had a chance to cross-examine him on the case under oath. What did you find out on this case?
Well, when I got to cross-examine Dr. Plotkin, depose Dr. Plotkin, and so before trial, so I got to sit in a room with him for about 9 hours. And the purpose of a deposition is before trial is for me to ascertain from the witness of the other side, what evidence do they have? What does it based on? What is it that they're going to rely upon, right? Now, this case involved a child where the mother did not want to vaccinate. The kid was completely unvaccinated. She was a few years old, completely healthy, by the way. No health issues, zero, okay? Where the dad, the parents are getting divorced, now wanted to start vaccinating, right? After all the years of not vaccinating, they're completely healthy child. They brought Dr. Plotkin in to give the opinion that the child should get all the vaccines. So obviously, that means that I wanted to know what evidence do you have to support, for example, that giving this child all these vaccines is safe. And so I had an opportunity to ask him that. Now, back then, I certainly was expecting some twists and turns. I didn't know as much as I know today, for sure. I knew plenty, but it's not like I've had 7 or 8 more years almost of work in this area. If you go to my office, there's not as many law books as there are medical textbooks. There are vaccinology, immunology, infectious disease, because that's the work I engage in. And so, during those almost 9 hours, what I found was that really the worst fears that are expressed about vaccines and the lack of proper safety are in large part true. And you have it out of the horse's mouth. People say, well, we should have a debate on vaccines. All right, well, go watch the deposition. You can see a debate for 9 hours, between a drooling lawyer, right? I'm just a lawyer, what do I know? And the world's leading vaccinologist. Surely he should have the answers. Surely he should be able to substantiate they were properly trialed before licensure, that there's proper post-licensure safety. You can watch the video, you can watch the deposition and judge for yourself, or you obviously read the book, and I go through some of the choice excerpts and I lay them out in chapter 1.
Yes, I invite everybody to take a look who wants to know the details, but there is one important thing inside. You ask him about clinical trials, and also you ask him about post-clinical trials after a licensee. And I read one study, and one of the co-authors was also Mr. Stanley Plotkin, and this study was published last year in autumn. And inside, they conclude they do not do enough clinical trials after licensee because there are lack of funds. That means they are admitting they are not taking care of adverse events after vaccination because they don't have enough money, and they need more money for it.
Listen, so my firm I mentioned has about 50 folks that do vaccine work. Well, you can't sue vaccine manufacturers for vaccine injury almost ever, okay? But you can bring a claim in a federal program here in the US. And in that program, you typically have to prove, for most injuries that you bring, causation. You have to prove the vaccine caused the injury. So we need good clinical trial and post-licensure data. Just when we have to substantiate claims. And I can tell you categorically, the notion that there is robust data and science out there that supports vaccine safety is just an absolute falsehood. It is not true. The clinical trials relied upon to license childhood vaccines, almost all are useless for assessing safety. Number one, not a single one of the routine injected childhood vaccines had a placebo control group. None. Not only that, which means that one group of kids got something inert, something that is safe, okay? And even when another vaccine was used as the control, which you can do if there is a properly licensed one, that vaccine was never properly licensed based on placebo-controlled trial. You can go down the chain. It doesn't exist. I lay it out in chapter 10 of my book. But even if they were properly controlled, right? You had a group that got the vaccine with a group that didn't. You still need to then review safety long enough. And virtually all these trials review safety for only days or weeks. And then even if you had a proper control and they reviewed safety for long enough, which they don't do, you need enough kids in the trial to be properly powered. Like that Hep B vaccine we talked about earlier, Recombivac's HB, the very first vaccine on the U.S. schedule, it was licensed for children based on a clinical trial. I can't even make this up. It's all on the FDA website. It had 147 kids, monitored safety for 5 days after injection, and there's no control group. That's a laughable study. That did not affirm its safety, but that's true of most child vaccines. So most of them come to market without knowing their safety profile. That's just a fact, just a fact. Then after they come to market, who's got the moneyed interest to do the post-licensure safety reviews properly? Nobody. There are a series of studies that have looked at kids with no vaccines or one or more that have done that comparison. There's about 10 of them, and they are consistent. They're smaller. Some are based on surveys. Some are based on looking at small pediatric practices, but they're consistent. They show the kids that have no vaccines are far healthier than the kids that have one or more vaccines. The kids who are vaccinated often have multiple times the rates of chronic health issues. And which chronic health issues? The very ones that, at least in the US, have exploded from the 1980s when we had only 3 injections in the first year of life, to today, where we have over 40 to 50% of kids with chronic disease in America. And we have about 25 injections by the first year of life. As of yesterday, 18 injections. And most of these chronic health issues that exploded are related to some form of immune system dysregulation. They can't figure out what's causing it. Maybe they should start with the very products they're injecting over and over again to modify the immune system.
There was a hearing in September. Senator Ron Johnson was organizing this hearing. And after you said that, what you told me now, there was a Dr. Scott, I think. He says there is a lot of studies, even 1,700, I think, and 661, I think, study, he said, that are clinical trials and they are proving safety and efficacy. Then after that, you explaining that he's not right. Can you tell us what was wrong about his statement?
Sure. Dr. Jake Scott, who's an infectious disease professor at Stanford University, prestigious university in the United States, okay, decided that, as he told CNN, a major news outlet here in the US, he told them that after he heard Robert F. Kennedy Jr. say that there's never been a routine injector child vaccine license based on a placebo-controlled trial, he knew that was false. He knew it, okay? Why? Because he believes, all right? And he set out to prove RFK Jr. wrong, which, by the way, is not how science works, but fine. This is what he decided to do. He reached his conclusion, and then he set out to prove it. And now, all he had to do to know what was relied upon to license each child the vaccine is go to the FDA website. That's what we do. And get the underlying clinical trial report. Did he do that? No. Instead, he set up a website in which he crowdsourced. Anybody in the world could submit, clinical trials studies that are published. He crowdsourced this list that pointed to this list and he said, see, there are 600 placebo-controlled trials out there for vaccines. And as you heard me respond, I went through all of them. We went through them at my firm, and not a single one of them is a placebo-controlled trial relied upon to license and inject a child the vaccine in the United States. Not a single one. None of them. First of all, I laid it out at the hearing, but over 500 of them have nothing to do with those childhood vaccines. Nothing to do with it. Another 70 of them don't involve children. It's like adults with AIDS, so it's just not extrapolatable. Another 20 or so are not. They claim they're placebos, but they're not. They're an injective of an adjuvant or another vaccine. And it left 3 that actually involved the licensure of a routine injected childhood vaccine. And those 3, when you look carefully at them, also were not placebos. And I went through that in the hearing. So his supposed mountain of evidence is just a smokescreen. He believes nobody's going to actually look at it. Presumably, that's what he believes. And he figures he's just going to throw a list at you and say, here, this proves safety. But how is studying an AIDS vaccine in Africa with HIV-positive folks tell you the safety of giving a Hep A vaccine to a baby? It doesn't. It's nonsense. One has nothing to do with the other. You want to show me that this Hep A vaccine is safe? Give me a study of this vaccine, or at least of a vaccine for Hep A that's the same formulation or similar formulation that's also trialed in children with the placebo. Give me something like that. That's not what he gives you. It's just the list that he's got is nonsensical. I also actually addressed that in the book.
Yeah, and he was very surprised.
He said, I'm very surprised that Mr. Siri has reviewed all 600 trials. He said, because I didn't even review them yet. What an incredible admission He admits he didn't actually review them, so how's he making a claim? But this is how the belief system works. This is why it's religion.
Yeah. Maybe he admitted because he was under oath. Well, there is also, you wrote to CDC and you were looking for proof that vaccines doesn't cause autism. This is a huge topic. Autism, a very important one, because you have a huge increase in the United States. But you receive, after 1.5 years of court case, you receive a confirmation that they don't have any proof that vaccines doesn't cause autism. That's why now there is a change in this, I think, in the website of CDC, that this statement, it's not supported by the science.
Yeah, so the claim that vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim. It's a belief, and I'll tell you why. Based on the surveys in the US, 40 to 70% of parents with autistic children will point to vaccines as the cause of their child's autism. Despite, by the way, billions of dollars spent to try to persuade them it's not the vaccines. Apparently, they can't unlearn their own experience. Okay, what vaccines do they point to? They point to the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life, okay, which are, there's 5 core vaccines given 3 times each: Hep B, Hib, DTaP, PCV, and IPV. Okay, 15 injections. And they point to MMR, which is given no earlier than the first year of life. So we said, okay, he would like to study CDC, and we sent not just a letter, we sent a formal Freedom of Information Act request, so formal mechanism in the US. We said, give us the studies that show that Hep B doesn't cause autism, that Hib doesn't cause autism, that DTaP doesn't cause autism, that IPV doesn't cause autism, that PCV doesn't cause autism. You say vaccines don't cause autism, show us that the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life don't cause autism. They didn't give anything, as you pointed out, sued them in federal court. And days before the initial conference, they finally gave us a list of 20 studies, 16 studies, 4 reviews. And I remember I called the DOJ attorney because maybe they thought we can't read, I don't know. And I said, hey, so the Department of Justice represents the CDC when you sue the federal government here, okay? And I said, look, you sent a list of 20 studies. 19 of them have nothing to do with the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life. They have to do with MMR, they have to do with thimerosal, an ingredient that's not even in these vaccines. I said, and then the one other one you gave is an Institute of Medicine review. It did look for any studies that support that DTaP, one of those 5, doesn't cause autism. And that review found only one study, and that did find a correlation between DTaP and autism. So basically, the only thing out of your list that relates to these vaccines is one study, and it found a correlation. Are you sure that your client, the CDC, wants to settle on the basis of this list? Came back. The Department of Justice signed it on behalf of the CDC. I signed it on behalf of my client. The federal judge signed it as an order of the court. And there it is. There's your list of 20, where else do you go? And this is what I mean about belief, what they tell you and what they have to admit when their back is to the wall and they have to give you an answer in federal court. They have no choice. And in this instance, it made it clear. They don't have any studies to show that those vaccines don't cause autism. And they pretended like they did. That's, my kid knows that's called lying.
Well, now we're coming to one, it's already famous or notorious, how you can say, inconvenient study, and there is a documentary about it. I had here as a guest Mr. Del Bigtree, who organized for us to start this study in 2017, I think. And after finally they finished this study, they didn't want to publish it. Can you tell us exactly some details about this? We've been through this, but I think it's important because this is the first study that's showing difference between children who are vaccinated and who are not vaccinated and overall health.
Oh, I should tell you, there are about 10 other studies out there that have compared kids with no vaccines with kids with 1 or more vaccines, and they are consistent. They all show that the kids who are vaccinated have multiple rate of the chronic health issues. And those studies most of them are published. Some of them are in PubMed, in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, they have, like I said, there are different kinds. Some are based on homeschool parental surveys. Some are based on government Medicaid data. Some are based on certain pediatric practices that happen to have a lot of unvaccinated kids in it. So they compare the vaccinated with the unvaccinated. I mean, they all are pretty consistent. And, this type of comparison, it's not like Dell decided, it's not just Dell who wanted this to be done, right? Or ICANN. The Institute of Medicine, which is a private organization here in the US, was paid by our federal health authorities to review the safety of the entire childhood schedule. They published that review in 2013, and they said, sorry, federal health authorities, you haven't really done a comparison between vax and unvax. How do we really answer this question? That's an important data to have. And so they said, but you can do it using some CDC data called the VSD. The CDC then commissioned a white paper. They paid hundreds of thousands of dollars on how to do this comparison that they published in 2015, okay? And so that's 10 years ago. Have they published that comparison? No. They've never published that comparison. Have they done the comparison? Seems to me unlikely they haven't. If you wanted to, quote unquote, shut up the anti-vaxxers and those same vaccines cause harm, why wouldn't you just do that comparison and publish it? I think you probably would. And I think the problem is that when you do that comparison, I suspect what you find is that no matter how you try to play with the numbers, you keep finding the same result that all these other studies are finding, that the vaccinated kids have multiple times the rate of chronic health issues as the unvaccinated.
Yeah, I noticed one more thing. First, when they are doing clinical trials, they are not comparing a random and placebo group, but also they said it's unethical if you want to do it, because first, before they are even starting clinical trials, they are they're introducing these vaccines. And after that, they said it's not ethical to not vaccinate the children. That's why we cannot make any more this placebo, random and placebo group clinical trials.
Okay, two things. First of all, the bioethical literature is very clear that it is unethical to use a product that has not been properly trialed before licensure. That is unethical. Using a Hep B vaccine that was licensed, it's in a trial with 147 kids and 5 days of safety monitoring, that's unethical. And what was the control? There was no other vaccine as the control. There was no control. Okay. And we can go down the list. We can go through every vaccine. And what you'll find is let me put it this way. If there was a Hep B vaccine that already existed and it was properly licensed on a placebo-controlled trial, that vaccine should have been the control. I agree. But it didn't. It didn't exist. And that Hep B vaccine, for example, that was the very first recombinant DNA technology vaccine in the history of the world. In America. It didn't exist before. Think about that. Just like we have a new mRNA vaccine with the new technology, that was the first recombinant DNA technology vaccine in America ever. So it should have been, not only should it have been a robust trial, it should have been an incredibly robust trial. You don't even have a historical comparator of any kind. It's not even like they use another Hep B vaccine to license it for children. So that's first of all. This notion of, so I agree, it would be unethical if there was a properly licensed hepatitis B vaccine for children that was properly licensed in a placebo control, long-term safety, properly powered trial. Absolutely, that should be the control, okay? Not a placebo. You don't have that. You don't have that for any vaccine, okay? So it's unethical not to use a placebo. Number two, I'm not talking about a clinical trial prospectively. I'm talking about using existing databases of information. Health insurance companies have the data. It's probably, we estimate, about 650,000 completely unvaccinated kids in America today. Their data sits in databases today. I'm not talking about continuing to keep, I'm saying use the existing data. There is nothing unethical about that. And there's nobody who argues, by the way, that's unethical, because it would be nonsensical to do so.
Well, you also mentioned, and also I saw that you cross-examined Dr. Kathleen Edwards. Why is she important, and what did you find out in this conversation?
Well, Dr. Edwards is one of the 4 authors of the medical editors of the medical textbook on vaccines in the United States, which is called Plotkin's Vaccines. It's Dr. Plotkin, obviously, Dr. Edwards, Dr. Paul Offit, and Dr. Walter Orenstein. They are, considered presumably the 4 world's leading vaccinologists. And in this deposition, I went through a lot of stuff that I went through with Dr. Plotkin. All those years later after Plotkin, you'd think she'd have better answers. She doesn't, because the facts are the facts. They can't create clinical trial data that doesn't exist. They can't go back in time and properly create trials, license these products. And after they're licensed, because of the ethical point that you pointed out, they won't do proper clinical trials. So they don't do it before they're licensed, and they don't do it afterwards because they say it's unethical. It's truly a religion of incredible proportion. And so, if you watch her deposition after you watch Dr. Plotkin, you realize that she has nothing more to give, let's put it that way. And she also, because it involved autism, specifically the issue of autism was at issue in this case, she should have come to that deposition prepared to fight me on autism, to give me the proof and the evidence. But yet when I asked her about, okay, what studies, do there studies that show that this Hep B vaccine doesn't cause autism, or this DTaP vaccine, or this, she also had to admit, I don't have any studies that show those don't cause autism.
Let's imagine that you are a pediatrician and I bring my kid to you and I want to ask you one question and you have to answer me, but according to your proof, that's something that you can prove in the court. Does my kid has to take these vaccines and are they safe and effective?
I don't think any pediatrician can properly affirm to you that any of the childhood vaccines are safe. Making that determination requires an appropriate clinical trial before it was licensed, which none of them have. And if you don't have that, at least in really robust post-licensure safety published studies, which you don't have. And so I don't know how any pediatrician could actually affirm to you that these products are actual safe. And by that, I also mean that the safety, that they are more likely to cause a benefit than harm. I'll just use the hepatitis B vaccine as an example. Again, it's estimated you need to inject about 100,000 kids who were born to non-Hep B positive mothers with that product, with the Hep B vaccine, to prevent one case of chronic Hep B amongst children. Okay, so that's what you need to do, 100,000. Okay, what's the rate of harm? Well, the rate of harm is based on the limited information that I have available, almost for certain exceeds that rate. So the benefits don't appear to outweigh the risks, right? And so an objective pediatrician who's being transparent and honest with the parent would go through it in that manner, but that's not how things happen in the real world.
And what about the HPV vaccines?
The real issue that the pharmaceutical industry has with the HPV vaccine is that they're not giving it to babies. See, the thing about babies, they can't talk. They can't explain the issues. But with HPV vaccines, you're typically giving it to teenage girls. Now, young, often 9, 10, 11 years old, but they can talk. They can explain things. They could say, hey, I'm dizzy. I'm having some dysautonomia. I'm having these issues. Quite inconvenient for them. And, one need only read some of the literature on the harms that those products can cause, or just go jump on one of these HPV vaccine support group forums for families whose children have been seriously injured by these products. You will get a very different view of these products very quickly than what the public health authorities tell you.
And for the end, can you say a few suggestions for parents in Croatia if they come to the pediatrician or to the authorities? What should they ask them? Which kind of proof they will ask, and before they decided what to do with vaccination of their children?
Well, one is I would ask them to sign a piece of paper that says that they're agreeing to be willing to held accountable for any injuries. If they're so safe, why shouldn't they sign it? What's the problem?
Yeah,
I would start there, and then on the pediatrician level. Then I would ask them, what was the trial relied upon to license it? And you show it to me. Ask them to pull it out. I think that you probably are not going to get much further than no. You'd probably be thrown out of the office at that point. And even though you're asking for some basic accountability and some basic information. As for politicians, do you have school mandates in Croatia?
Well, we have some mandates here, and it's mandates for children even to go to the kindergarten. And that's why this question is very important, because people need to vaccinate the kids, even if they want to do in the public school or in public kindergarten. Not school, really, kindergarten. But for private, they don't have to.
Private, they don't have to. And is there any exceptions for public school?
Yes, there is some, but I'm not sure in detail which one. And that's why now we have lots of pressure on these children, exactly on their parents, and even some cases, court cases, because of course people doesn't accept it. Lots of people already know what is happening. They are well informed, but they still have a huge pressure from the side of authorities.
I mean, I would encourage meeting with your politicians, every parent out there affected by this, because educating those who are making these decisions is critically important. I don't know what it's like there, but here, if you get a bunch of constituents, citizens together that are from the district of that local politician, they'll have a meeting with you. Most people just don't reach out to politicians. So when finally a group do to come to meet, especially at the more local level, they'll meet with them. And it doesn't mean you have to go in and change your mind about everything. But I would just show them a few things. Number one, that most vaccines don't stop transmission. Proof for that, as you know, is in chapter 9 of my book. All CDC, FDA, WHO material. It's nothing you could really argue with. Show them that. Say, well, if it's not stop transmission, how could you even require it? How is it different than requiring asthma inhalers or heart medicine? Maybe we think it's good, but we don't take away people's rights over something that's just personal protection. That's number one. And number two, you could show them for the other vaccines that do stop transmission, the concerns that exist and how you've got to let individuals have choice. Government's sitting in the position to persuade people already. That's not enough. They can't persuade people on the merits. We should never take away people's right, individual and civil right, because once we start doing that, the line just keeps moving and moving. And that should be something that just doesn't get crossed. So I would very much encourage. And if all that meeting does is just lodge a little thought, just, let them think about these products, you've already gotten way down the road, because they're not believing, they're thinking. And that's really important when it comes to these products. So they don't act instinctually. They take a moment to really reflect on what they're about to do.
Yes, and according to this 1986 Act, producer of vaccine has no liability for injuries, but also doctors.
The National Child Vaccine Injury Act of 1986 provided immunities not only for the pharmaceutical companies, but also for the doctors giving the injections, right? It's really a really troubling law.
Mr. Siri, thank you very much. Thank you for your work, exceptional work, for your book. I will highly recommend to everybody to read this book. And of course, this is very important to ask questions for the pediatrician and other authorities. Do they know what is in this book?
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Evo, dragi narode, danas ste imali priliku čuti kako to izgleda sa nekim koji ovo što govori i ono što je napisao u knjizi mora dokazati na sudu. I to je ono što, još jedanput ponavljam, je najvažnije u razgovoru sa nekim koji je odvjetnik, iako nije u toj struci, dakle nije doktor, ne bavi se proizvodnjom cjepiva. Međutim, ono što govori mora dokazati. Ne može doći nepripremljen i ne može govoriti ono što misli. Dakle, mišljenje nije važno, nego ono što mogu dokazati. I zato je važno da pročitate ovu knjigu, jer ne samo tu knjigu, nego i ono koju smo obradili sa doktorom Peterom McCallum, u kojoj jasno pokazuje se da stvari koje danas slušate od pedijatara, ne samo u Hrvatskoj, nego u cijelom svijetu, nije baš ono što oni mogu dokazati. Ili još bolje, pitajte ih što mogu dokazati, pa ako vam ponude neki od ovih studija koje smo danas spominjali, možete im slobodno uputiti da pročitaju i da pogledaju te studije, jer te studije ne pokazuju ono što tvrde, a to je da su cjepiva za djecu efikasna i sigurna. Najiskrenije ono što mogu reći i ovo što je gospodin Aaron Siri danas rekao jeste da uglavnom ne mogu dokazati, da ne znaju, jer jednostavno se ne rade ispitivanja za to, a ne prate se niti nuspojave nakon cjepiva dovoljno dugo da bi se moglo sa sigurnošću reći da nema nuspojava. Stoga, nedostatak informacija im ne daje za pravo da tvrde da je tako. Nadam se da će ovo pomoći mnogim roditeljima koji imaju sličan problem jer su, nažalost, žrtve marketinga koje dolazi iz, naravno, zainteresiranih strana koji su zainteresirane prvenstveno da prodaju proizvod, a ne baš da taj proizvod postigne željeni rezultat jer je profit, nažalost, ispred zdravlja. Stoga, danas imate priliku znati ono što se može dokazati, pročitati, ponudite vašim doktorima, pedijatrima, pa neka oni se očituju ako misle drugačije. Nadam se da vam se svidjela današnja tema i moj današnji gost i uskoro se vidimo u sljedećoj epizodi Slobodni.
Nitko vas neće natjerati da se poklonite zvijeri, učinit ćete to svojevoljno, odbacujući vjeru. Bićete laka meta za zvijer, jer se niste podredili vjeri. Ako se ne podredite vjeri, podredit ćete se zvijeri. Toliko ćete se suobličiti sa ovim svijetom, da nećete ni prepoznati da ste u zabludi. Biće to najveća demonska prevara ikada i pravedno zaslužena osuda nad nepokajanim grešnicima. Gdje su